Welcome to Bat Therapy, mental health through the lens of comics and film. Be a fly on the wall or a bat in the cave, listening in on a friendship built out of a love for talking Batman, comics, and the everyday struggle to achieve mental health and happiness.
We're your hosts, clinical psychologist Dr. Amelia Brown and educator and comic aficionado Keaton Hopkins. Don't forget to follow us on YouTube and social media and find our Patreon at patreon.com/battherapy.
This podcast is about providing education and understanding and is not a replacement for mental health treatment or support. If you're needing help, go to bat-therapy.com for resources. So, what better time to talk about imposter syndrome than when we're talking about literally the first Robin trained by Batman trying to come into his own. I once I thought of this idea, I was like, I have to look into imposter syndrome.
I feel like, Dick Grayson probably struggled with that throughout. He grew up in the circus and then went from being in a circus to being a billionaire's child.
Yeah. And
even just that.
Yeah.
Having someone that made your sandwiches for you, going to private school, out of nowhere, there's so much that he had to there's so many times I feel like he probably felt like he did not belong.
Yeah.
Especially from the world I feel like that he went to. When it comes to his skills as an acrobat, he probably never felt like he was lacking. But when it came to being next to these people that have always lived in this world.
So, maybe. Where I start wondering about imposter syndrome for him is when it comes to Batman. Because, he grew up. So, okay. So, I think that Dick Grayson, it was probably the person best set up to be able to handle any imposter syndrome that comes his way in being trained by Batman. Because, like you said, he was trained in the circus to do these acrobatic things. It's a very special skill set.
Right.
Never really goes into how he feels about how he compares to his family. I think he was the youngest in most, if not all, storylines. But
yes, that's true.
But very much seems like a wholesome family, and he seems very confident and comfortable in the circus world. And so I definitely think that sets him up well in terms of having a sense of I have a skill set. It sets me apart. I mean, how many people can say that they are an acrobat, for goodness sake?
Right.
And so I think that sets him up well. But then, like you mentioned, he goes into this very nuanced world, billionaire, I guess millionaire, billionaire, depending on what year it was written. It's billions at this point.
Definitely.
Into this billionaire's life. Here is Batman, who, if anything is going to be intimidating, here is a human, no superpowers, who can be compared to and be set up against the others in the Justice League, right?
Yeah.
Can fight Superman. Yeah. And so you have all these there's storylines that talk about how hesitant he is to put on the bat suit when, Bruce is injured or might be dead at times. And just in Nightwing Year One, we talked about how he is going around and just trying to find himself in terms of coming out from under Batman, and how hard it was to have Bruce see him as his own separate entity worth being separate and not a sidekick.
Right.
A lot of interesting stuff there.
Yeah. And I also feel is it, because I know we're talking with imposter syndrome, is it still imposter syndrome if you're in a situation where someone is making you feel like you can, it's a standard you can never meet? Because
Such a good
it's
question.
one thing to feel like you're not good enough.
Yeah.
It's another thing for someone to constantly tell you
Yes.
you're not good enough, right?
So really, really cool question that you're asking. So when we're talking about imposter syndrome and so I was like, ooh, what research is there out there? Because we
Mhm.
all talk about imposter syndrome, but I was like, I've never looked into the psychology of it.
Right.
So uh imposter phenomenon
Okay.
was the first term out there. And so essentially what we're talking about is a person feels like they're a fraud or they're not good enough, but they're getting away with it in some way.
Okay.
And there's usually also a fear of being exposed. Someone's going to find out that I don't belong here or I'm not good enough.
Okay.
And so what you're hitting on is a really interesting piece. So um when imposter syndrome or imposter phenomenon was first highlighted, it was in the late 1970s.
Okay.
It was by doctors Clance and Imes or Imes. I don't know how to pronounce that. But so these were clinicians that, go figure, they were doing therapy with a lot of high achieving women. And they were like, here's an interesting pattern we're noticing. And when I read that, I was like, of course, it's a bunch of women.
Oh boy. Here we go.
Yeah. So then it kind of had to go through a process. It's not just women that get this. And of course, at that point, and I say of course because unfortunately this was often a thing. So this was like mostly white people that they were looking at, which tended to be the case at the time. So over time, they found okay, it's not just women. It's not just white people. It's not most people. The majority of people at some point have some sense of imposter syndrome, but one of the interesting things that's come up recently is what you're hitting on. So
Okay.
some people, particularly women, particularly people of color, are
Mhm.
pointing out that, um, okay, sometimes this is an internal thing. And then what you were hitting on, sometimes it's an environmental thing.
Right.
And so, um, very much, and so a lot of folks that do this research are encouraging thinking of having both. Like a person could have both or they could have one. So you could have imposter
Mhm.
syndrome that's coming from perfectionism, coming from this sense of um uh when I have accomplishments, I see it as luck. And I have trouble being able to see myself as comparable to my peers in whatever my profession or my discipline or whatever it is. But then there's also this separate type that you could have that is more environmentally dependent. So if there are microaggressions, for example, if there are ways that a person's being discriminated against, or if they're in an environment where they don't see a lot of people like themselves there, those are two examples of situations where a person is actually much more likely to have imposter syndrome,
Mhm.
but it might not be something so internal to them. It might be a reaction to, like you said, maybe a very critical place where, well, let's be real. Bruce Wayne Batman's not too good at telling you what you're doing well at. He's a lot better at telling you what you need to improve.
Right.
So it's honestly probably really good that Dick Grayson tends to be an easygoing guy. He has a personality that lets a lot of things roll off his back, or
Right.
he would probably have just some super intense imposter syndrome because of how Bruce Wayne is about stuff.
Okay, so two things with that then. Cuz it sounds like it's not possible to have imposter syndrome unless you're comparing yourself to someone else,
That's a good question.
right?
So I think it would be technically possible, but it's a lot less likely. So here's a really cool thing that actually made me think about our podcast. So
Excellent.
one of I know, right?
I just did a little
Uh
shimmy.
yeah, little shimmies. So fun fact, this podcast almost didn't happen because of my own imposter syndrome. I mean, Keaton, you know the story,
I
and
do.
people have been listening long enough might already know, but I did not think that I was an expert enough to do a podcast. Um, and so then I talked to my husband and then later to Keaton, and they're like, what are you talking about? You absolutely are an expert. We want to hear what you have to say. So this actually hit on something that they've found, which is there tends to be some sort of comparison that's
Mhm.
happening. Not necessarily, but there's much higher chance of there being imposter syndrome if you have something to compare yourself to.
Mhm.
And so what's interesting is that they found if you spent a lot of time with your peers, they were looking at, I think, graduate students and med students and stuff like that. So people who are really prone to some imposter syndrome.
Mhm.
And the more time they spent with their peers, the more imposter syndrome they had. And so what they were figuring out was that if you're not careful, those social comparisons, we a lot of times more easily count what other people succeed at and we don't see their failures as readily.
Mhm.
Kind of like how an example they gave on a resume or a CV, you put all the things that you've published, you've done, you don't put all the rejections.
Right.
So there are all these ways that if you're with your peers, you might see all their successes, but not necessarily the struggles. And
Mm.
so those comparisons are happening and can worsen that sense of being a fraud. So what they found, two things can be helpful. One is if you are comparing yourself to other people, make sure that you're sharing your failures essentially with each other so
Right.
there's more support and hopefully seeing like, oh hey, we're all in this together and can move forward. So you have more of that realistic comparison.
Right.
But also what I did, which is going to people, getting support from people who are not in your field. So if you're if you're only talking to people that you're comparing yourself to or that, are doing the thing that you're essentially grading yourself at, you're you're just a lot of times you're increasing that chance that you're going to compare yourself to whoever it is you're talking to, right? It's
Right.
like this nasty catch 22. But if I talk to my friends who aren't psychologists, who aren't in mental health, and I say, "Hey, I don't think I should do this thing because I'm not an expert enough." And you guys go, "What do you mean you're not an expert? You did the training, you've done all this clinical work, you've done this, that, and the other." And and that's when I stepped back and realized, oh, what you all need in an expert in a podcast is not the person who, I'm not the person who published the articles on this thing,
Yeah.
but I'm a person who can know it, understand it, and explain it to someone who's not a psychologist.
Yeah.
So that was a fun little discovery I found. So yeah, the social comparison doesn't necessarily have to be there, but
Yeah.
it's most likely there because the more you're comparing yourself to other people, the more likely that it's gonna flare on you, the imposter syndrome.
And I feel like as a superhero,
Mhm.
imposter syndrome has to be even heavier. Like I can't
God, I
imagine
know, right?
being Batman's sidekick and being like, "Oh, I saved the mailman today." And you turn on the TV and it's Superman punching a volcano into not erupting. Like
I didn't even think about you're comparing what you yeah.
like
Oh.
it's gotta be difficult when you're thinking, "Oh, I'm gonna do fight the good fight. I'm gonna save as many people as I can."
Mhm.
And it's like, man, Superman just flew around the world and stopped it from spinning too fast. The Flash just went back in time and stopped World War III. Like, like like I would
He
love a
might have destroyed the
superhero.
world 3 times in saving
Yeah.
his mom,
I
but
I would love a superhero social media page. It's like, who'd Superman
oh
take a
god.
selfie with today? Like,
You know what? I didn't even the things I was looking at weren't even talking about social media. I'm sure that makes things so much
oh
worse
my
because it
gosh,
right?
yes.
It's so much about putting on a show,
And yeah, you
showing
only
the
put
best
your
light of
wins.
things.
Yeah,
You put your wins. Absolutely. So, um yeah, I think what you're talking about is so interesting because yeah, so let's say you're a sidekick of Batman. So one, the things that you feel pride in, yeah, you look around, the superhero world has to be so tough, especially if you weren't one of the originals.
hmm
Like let's talk about the big ones in the Justice League. Um I think that's why actually a lot of us are really drawn toward their sidekicks and a lot of those stories is
yeah,
because it's how we all feel in this world when you're not those originals who by the way had to figure it out and don't know what they're doing all of the time, and they're going by the seat of their pants, but it doesn't look like it from the outside for everybody else.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
that's
it's but
so
that
tough.
and it's why we love Batman. Batman is
Yeah.
literally standing next to the fastest man alive,
Mhm.
Superman, an Amazon goddess,
Yep.
a space policeman,
Mhm.
and a cyborg that can control the internet with his finger. And
Yeah.
he's just like, whatever. Like I do
Yeah.
love
So
absolutely love that about, because if I were a regular human being that was
yeah.
like a super trained athlete, and it's like, all right, y'all, we got to go fight Darkseid. I'm going home. I'm going home. Like, you guys got to go fight Darkseid. I
See ya.
am a 100% regular ass human.
I'm going to take a nap.
I'm gonna go right. I'm gonna go back to I'm gonna go back to Gotham, and maybe I'll fight the
So
plant person. I'm gonna
So
fight
this
the
is
plant
actually a
person.
really interesting point. So, when it comes to Nightwing, I was like, okay, so he's got some times where he's got to figure it out. Um, but all in all, he handles any potential imposter syndrome, imposter phenomenon pretty well. I mean, he puts on the bat suit sometimes when it's needed. He creates Nightwing. He goes and he does all of these things, and definitely some of his personality seems to come into play. And one of the things I was thinking of too is that so keeping in mind how the environment affects things, our our world, at least here in the United States, has been built up to be easiest for white men, particularly straight, cisgender white men. And so I actually put like, you know what? Those are probably things that help make it easier for him to not have imposter syndrome. But you're bringing up a really good point. Uh, being a man, like a human, uh, actually might not be helpful when it comes to superhero imposter syndrome. If anything, you're one of the lone ones without powers. And so that actually works against him
Yeah,
and can make all of this that much harder because, yeah, when you're looking around and there aren't very many people like you, and the ones that are Batman, who, let's be real, is not just kind of showing
not
you a
normal.
list of, yeah, he's not normal.
He's
He's
not
not
the
going
one to
to
try and compare yourself to.
He's not yeah. So
No.
first off, he's almost superhuman in terms of what he's able to train himself to do.
Right.
And then in addition to that, he's not, shall we say, the best communicator, and not the warmest and fuzziest. And so one of the things that can really help is him opening up about his struggles and what he's done. And he does that in his own way,
Yeah.
but it I mean, it takes Dick years to be able to understand that, oh, these are ways that Bruce was trying to help me and
Right.
show me his process. But Bruce isn't, yeah, he's not
No.
the
He
slickest at that
he
part.
doesn't have
So it's a
superpowers,
tough
but he's
road.
nowhere close to normal.
No, he's not
Yeah,
normal. But,
absolutely.
Dick's never been normal either. And
Right.
that really has worked to his credit. I
Yeah,
mean, it really, that honestly might be one of the things that helps him the most. Because
absolutely.
he's been used to being an oddball and also like being in the circus. So not only does he have all this skill set, but you have tons of people, normal, regular, everyday people coming and looking at you and staring and wanting to see you do your thing. So one, he's used to standing out of the crowd and he probably has a decent sense of his skill set, at least from that perspective.
Mhm.
But two, he's used to not necessarily blending in with everybody and might be able to mentally handle that in ways that, like, I don't know, might be more of a struggle for some of the other Robins.
Absolutely, because the thing is, it's one thing. It's almost like getting a promotion.
Mm,
It's just like getting a promotion. If you've worked at a job for a very, very long time, you're good at your job, you're great at your job, and then all of a sudden you get a promotion to the next level up,
mm,
and there's still that feeling where you're like, "Oh, if I can do this, I was good at that
hmm.
job. That doesn't
Yeah.
mean I'm good at this job." And that's exactly what Dick was feeling, because up until up until then, every direction he took, every order he took was coming from Batman.
Yeah. Now he's gotta take his own direction.
Now he's
That's
running his own
terrifying.
business, right?
Yeah.
He's taking his own direction. He's got his own costume, his own apartment. He fights crime on his watch.
He's
It's a
gotta make his
whole
own
thing,
sandwiches now.
right? And on top of that, all of a sudden, he's realizing how difficult it was being the head of all of that.
Yeah.
Like,
Yep.
oh, I gotta make sure that the oil levels are good on the Nightwing cycle or
Mhm.
whatever. I have to make sure that I have income
Yep.
now.
Yep.
You know,
There are
yeah.
it's such a good point that you're bringing up about how he's gotta make all of these decisions and be in charge of all of these things, and it's very hard to be able to step back and observe yourself and be able to say, "How am I doing with these things?" And it can be really hard to just gauge and take in the right data, if
Hmm.
that makes sense. Like, okay, how do I make sure I'm paying attention to the thing? I mean, it's one thing if like, okay, is the motorcycle gassed up all the time?
Yeah.
That's easy enough, but did I make the right decision in how I went about going after this villain? Or um did I even make the right decision leaving Batman and
Hmm.
doing this on my own? There are all these complicated things that are really hard to be able to, cuz he's in it. He's in the thick of it.
Hmm.
And so that's why, and I was talking earlier, like having people, you got to be careful who they are because you could start comparing yourself and it makes everything worse. But
Hmm.
I mean, he does a lot of things. I mean, he even goes back to the circus sometimes. He goes to Batgirl and Oracle. He goes to the Titans. He has all these different people, and Dick seems to have this where he goes through, these processes where he checks in with people, and that's probably helping him be able to calibrate and figure out, okay, so like, how am I doing with this? Am I
Hmm.
going in the right direction for me?
Right.
And yeah, it's got to be so intimidating to go from being Robin to being on your own.
And the thing is, what does help Dick, and I think you might have touched on it before too, is how he can see Bruce's flaws. He's not
Yes.
holding him up
Mhm.
on this giant pedestal like he can do no wrong. He's absolutely perfect. I have to be just like him. And that's one thing that I think really helps him because
I
I
100%
I,
agree.
I think a lot of the times imposter syndrome always happens because deep down you feel like someone else or everyone else is doing a better job than
Mm.
you are. And that's why you don't belong. I
Well, and there
haven't
can
been,
be this
yeah.
thing of their way is the right way, or
Hmm.
these are the exact points of success.
Right.
There tends to be a rigidity of it and a perfectionism too of here is this height that has to be reached. That's a really good point that you're bringing up, is that one of the nice things about Dick is that he, on the one hand, really respects Batman and knows that Batman is really at the peak of a lot of things in terms of doing that job. And at the same time, Bruce Wayne is not perfect and not even Batman's perfect. And he's able to see those things.
Hmm.
And from very early on, he's able to say being Batman does not make sense for me.
Hmm.
That's not how I can excel. I have to do this my own way. I think you're right. That difference is so key because if he's aiming for Batman, he's first off, he's not gonna be able to do it in this at the same extent that Bruce does it. He's
Right.
gotta, in order to truly excel, he's got to be able to do his own thing
Got to
and
do
not
his
force
own thing.
himself into like pigeonholing himself into something that might probably isn't gonna fit.
Yeah. And I think this is something that everybody goes through at some point. It's such a good thing to talk about because I know that I've had imposter syndrome in probably every aspect of life. Every
Mm,
job I've ever been on, at one point, I'm like, I'm not good enough for this, or I'm looking at everybody and feeling like they're doing it better than I am. Even with being a parent, It can be
Mhm.
difficult, especially when you're looking around and everyone else's kid is doing this thing and yours is acting out in this way and doing all this, or you don't have the amount of patience that even your significant other
Mm.
or has, or the other parent has. It makes you, and it can make you feel like you aren't built for it, you're not good enough, when in reality it's just that you're different, you're finding your path, and
Yes.
it's only your path.
Yeah. And I think you're right. I think that's key. It's your path, and also perfection is not the goal. Cuz I mean even Batman's not perfect. Come on. The peak of human superheroism, and Batman's not perfect.
Right.
And yeah, I totally agree with you that it's about finding your own path and making sure that you don't inadvertently pigeonhole yourself and keep yourself
Hmm.
from excelling by hyper focusing on just one way
Right.
of being successful,
Right.
because y- we can't predict everything. That's the kind of the beauty of things. There's so many things that we learn, achieve, and figure out from failure, from falling, from stumbling, from the unexpected. And we see things as flaws sometimes that are actually the very route to helping us excel.
That's a yeah. I think that was worded perfectly.
Thanks for nerding out with us. I'm clinical psychologist Dr. Amelia Brown.
And I'm educator and comic aficionado Keaton Hopkins. Check out my TV and movie reviews on YouTube at Team JBS. Check out our website at bat-therapy.com, our Bat Therapy YouTube channel, and follow us on social media. And don't forget our Patreon page at patreon.com/battherapy. See you next week. Same bat time, same bat channel.